The rental car's engine ticked as it cooled in the empty gravel lot, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of Millfield's abandoned Main Street. David Hartwell sat behind the wheel for a long moment, his 46-year-old hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the weathered steeple rising above the tree line. The white paint had long since peeled away, revealing grey wood underneath like old bones breaking through skin. His mother's funeral had been 3 days ago. 3 days of condolences from neighbors who barely remembered him, of standing beside a casket in a room that smelled of lilies and regret. Now, with the will read and the house sold to the first buyer who'd shown interest, there was only one place left to visit before he could leave this godforsaken town forever. The car door slammed with a hollow echo as David stepped onto the cracked asphalt. His dress shoes crunched on fallen leaves as he approached the chain-link fence that now surrounded the property. A faded sign hung crooked on the gate. Property condemned keep, OUT Millfield County. Someone had cut a hole in the fence years ago, the metal curled back like fingers, trying to keep something in rather than keeping people out. The church building itself leaned slightly to the left, as if the weight of all the prayers said within its walls had finally become too much to bear. Ivy crept up the sides, threading through broken windows and wrapping around the bell tower like green veins. The front steps had cracked and separated, weeds pushing through the gaps with the persistence of things that refused to stay buried. But it was the back of the church that drew David forward, his feet moving of their own accord along the overgrown path. The forest had reclaimed much of the clearing, oak and maple trees standing sentinel where once there had been open ground. Somewhere in that tangle of brambles and shadow lay the answer to a question that had haunted him for 35 years. David closed his eyes and felt the autumn wind cut through his jacket. When he opened them again, the years seemed to fall away like leaves from a dying tree. The sounds of the present distant highway traffic, a dog barking somewhere in town, faded into the background, replaced by the phantom echo of church bells calling the faithful to Sunday service. His adult mind began to slip backward through time, pulled by the inexorable gravity of memory toward that terrible afternoon, when he was 11 years old and the world as he knew it shattered like glass. "I still remember what I saw behind that church in 1987. He whispered to the empty air, his breath visible in the gathering dusk. The words hung there for a moment before the wind carried them away, just as it had carried away his childhood pleas for someone, anyone, to believe him. The 11-year-old David Hartwell had always been different from the other children in Millfield. While his classmates formed clusters on the playground, trading baseball cards and sharing secrets, David preferred the company of books and his own imagination. His dark hair fell across his forehead in perpetual need of a trim, and his clothes hand-me-downs from his older sister Sarah never quite fit properly. But it was his eyes that set him apart most of all, wide, curious, and startlingly observant, as if he could see things others missed. Sunday mornings were torture for the boy. The Hartwell family occupied the same pew every week, third row from the front, right side, where David would fidget through Pastor Williams' interminable sermons about sin and salvation. The wooden bench seemed designed specifically to punish small boys, too hard for comfort, too smooth to provide any distraction through tactile exploration. His father, Robert Hartwell, sat rigid as a statue, his weathered farmer's hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the pulpit with the same intensity he reserved for checking his cornfields for signs of blight. His mother, Margaret, clutched her worn Bible like a lifeline, occasionally shooting warning glances at David when his restlessness became too apparent. But it was during those endless hours of spiritual instruction that David discovered his escape route. The church's restroom was located at the back of the building, accessible through a narrow hallway that led to a side door. Pastor Williams never seemed to notice when the boy slipped out, claiming the urgent call of nature, only to disappear for 20 or 30 minutes at a time into the world beyond those suffocating walls. The area behind St. Mark's Lutheran Church had become David's secret kingdom. Here, ancient oak trees formed natural climbing frames, their thick branches perfect for a boy who dreamed of being an explorer or a naturalist like the ones he read about in National Geographic. Fallen logs served as balance beams and imaginary bridges across treacherous ravines. Most importantly, The forest was quiet in a way the church never was, not the oppressive quiet of forced reverence, but the living silence of growing things and hidden creatures going about their ancient business. David knew every inch of that woodland clearing. He could identify bird calls, track the path of deer through the underbrush, and had even discovered a family of raccoons that made their home in a hollow stump near the creek. His pockets were always full of treasures. Unusual stones, interesting seed pods, the occasional feather or piece of shed snakeskin. His mother constantly scolded him for the dirt under his fingernails and the grass stains on his church clothes, but David couldn't help himself. The natural world called to him in a way that Pastor William's fire and brimstone rhetoric never could. It was this curiosity, this compulsion to explore and understand, that would lead him to witness something that would change his life forever. If he had been a different kind of child, less observant, less drawn to solitude, more willing to sit still and absorb the lessons about obedience and faith perhaps, he never would have seen what lurked in the shadows behind the house of God. Perhaps he would have grown up normal, unmarked by the terrible knowledge that sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes they hide in plain sight among the righteous. October 11, 1987. The date would be burned into David's memory forever. Though at the time it seemed like any other Sunday afternoon, Pastor Williams had been particularly long-winded that day. His sermon about the wages of sin stretching past the usual hour mark. David's legs had gone numb from sitting still, and his stomach growled audibly during the final prayer, earning him a sharp elbow from his sister Sarah and a withering look from his mother. As soon as the congregation began filing out, exchanging pleasantries and plans for the church potluck next weekend, David made his escape. He mumbled something about needing the bathroom and slipped through the familiar side door, the cool autumn air hitting his face like a blessing. The leaves had turned brilliant shades of orange and red, carpeting the forest floor in a rustling tapestry that crunched satisfyingly under his scuffed Sunday shoes. David had planned to check on the raccoon family. He'd brought them some leftover dinner rolls from Friday night, carefully wrapped in a napkin and hidden in his jacket pocket. But as he approached the hollow stump where they made their home, a sound stopped him cold. It was the unmistakable noise of someone moving through the underbrush, branches snapping and leaves rustling with the heavy, deliberate steps of an adult. The boy froze, instinctively pressing himself against the thick trunk of an oak tree. His heart hammered against his ribcage as he peered around the bark, trying to see who else might be in his secret sanctuary. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. A man emerged from the deeper woods, struggling with something heavy and unwieldy. He was tall and thin, wearing dark work clothes that blended with the shadows between the trees. David recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Kowalski, the church's groundskeeper and janitor. But there was something wrong with the way he moved, furtive and urgent, constantly glancing back over his shoulder as if afraid of being followed. The thing he carried was what made David's breath catch in his throat. It was a large black garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind his father used for yard work, but this one bulged and sagged in ways that made David's stomach lurch. As Mr. Kowalski stumbled slightly over a root, something tumbled from the improperly sealed opening of the bag. It rolled a few feet through the fallen leaves before coming to rest against a fallen branch. David squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was pale and round, about the size of a softball, with what looked like dark sockets staring sightlessly at the canopy above. The boy's 11-year-old mind struggled to process the reality of what lay scattered in the autumn leaves. But some deep, primal part of his brain screamed the truth at him with terrifying clarity. Mr. Kowalski cursed under his breath, a word David had never heard spoken aloud, and quickly retrieved the fallen object, shoving it back into the bag with rough, panicked movements. Then he began to dig, using a small folding shovel that he pulled from his belt. The sound of metal biting into earth filled the clearing, rhythmic and terrible. But it was what David heard next that would haunt his nightmares for decades to come. From inside the bag came a sound, soft, muffled, but unmistakably organic. A whimper, or perhaps a sob, barely audible above the scraping of the shovel. The bag moved slightly, a subtle shift that suggested something inside was still alive, still fighting. David's vision tunneled. the edges of the world going dark as his young mind recoiled from the implications of what he was witnessing. His legs gave out, and he slumped against the oak tree, bark scraping against his back through his Sunday shirt. The sound of his own ragged breathing seemed impossibly loud in his ears, and he pressed both hands over his mouth, terrified that Mr. Kowalski would hear him and turn those wild, desperate eyes in his direction. Time seemed to stretch and distort. The digging continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, Mr. Kowalski threw the shovel aside and began dragging the bag toward the freshly dug hole. David squeezed his eyes shut, but he could still hear the awful sounds, the thud of something heavy hitting the bottom of the pit, the scrape of dirt being shoveled back into place, and underneath it all, a silence that felt more terrible than any scream. When David finally opened his eyes, Mr. Kowalski was gone. The clearing looked almost normal, except for a patch of disturbed earth near the back wall of the church, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. David remained frozen against the tree for another 10 minutes, his entire body shaking with shock and terror, before his mother's voice calling his name from the front of the church finally broke the spell. He ran then, crashing through the underbrush with none of his usual care for the creatures that called the forest home. He burst through the side door of the church just as his family was preparing to leave, his face flushed and his clothes disheveled. His mother took one look at him and frowned. "David Michael Hartwell, what on earth have you been doing? You look like you've seen a ghost." If only she knew how close to the truth she was. The ride home was torture. David sat in the back seat of his father's old Buick, wedged between his sister Sarah and the window, his small body vibrating with the need to speak, to tell someone what he had witnessed. The words felt like they were clawing at his throat, desperate to escape, but every time he opened his mouth, the memory of that pale round object rolling through the leaves made his voice disappear. Sarah chatted about the youth group meeting planned for Wednesday, her voice bright with teenage enthusiasm about some boy named Marcus who had supposedly smiled at her during the service. His parents discussed mundane things: the price of corn, Mrs. Henderson's hip replacement, whether they should plant winter wheat in the south field. Normal Sunday conversation that felt surreal and distant, as if David were listening to it through water. The moment they pulled into the gravel driveway of their farmhouse, David bolted from the car. He barely made it to the front porch before the words came tumbling out in a breathless, panicked rush. "Mom, Dad, I saw something terrible behind the church. Mr. Kowalski was there, and he had this bag, and there was something in it, and I think it was a person, and he buried it, and I heard, 'Whoa, there, son.'" His father's voice cut through his rambling like a blade. Robert Hartwell was a practical man, weathered by decades of farming and disappointment, with little patience for what he considered childish nonsense. "Slow down. What's this about Mr. Kowalski?" David took a shuddering breath and tried again, forcing himself to speak more slowly. "I was in the woods behind the church, and I saw Mr. Kowalski carrying this big black bag. Something fell out of it, something that looked like ... like a head. And then he dug a hole and put the bag in it and covered it up." The silence that followed felt heavier than the October air. His mother, Margaret, had stopped halfway up the porch steps, her church purse clutched against her chest. Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically, but there was something uncertain in her expression, as if she couldn't quite dismiss the terror in her little brother's voice. It was Robert who spoke first, his tone measured and dismissive. "David, son, you've got quite an imagination on you. Mr. Kowalski takes care of the church grounds. He probably buried some dead animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum that died near the building, but it wasn't an animal." David's voice cracked with desperation. "I saw it, Dad. It was round and white, and it had holes where the eyes should be, and that's enough." Margaret's voice was sharp, cutting through his description like a slap. She climbed the remaining steps and fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking slightly. "I won't have you telling such horrible stories, especially about Mr. Kowalski. That man has served our church faithfully for 15 years. Sarah snorted, flipping her feathered hair over her shoulder. "God, David, you're so weird. You probably saw a dead cat, and your stupid imagination turned it into some horror movie. You watch too much TV." "I don't watch horror movies." David protested, his voice rising to a near shriek. "Mum, you have to believe me. We have to call the police. We have to. We're not calling anyone." Robert's voice carried the final authority of paternal decision. "You're 11 years old, son, and you spend too much time alone in those woods making up stories. Sometimes, when you're by yourself that much, your mind starts playing tricks on you." The door slammed behind Margaret with a finality that felt like a coffin closing. David stood on the porch, his small fists clenched at his sides, hot tears streaming down his cheeks. Sarah pushed past him with a disgusted sound. "You're such a baby," she muttered, but there was something almost gentle in her cruelty. As if she felt sorry for him, despite herself. "Just forget about it, okay? Nobody likes kids who make up scary stories for attention." That evening, after a dinner where conversation carefully avoided any mention of David's outburst, Margaret found him in his room, sitting on his narrow bed and staring out the window toward the distant church steeple. She sat down beside him, her weight causing the old mattress springs to creak. "Sweetheart," she said softly, her voice carrying the patient tone she used when explaining difficult concepts. "Sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're somewhere we shouldn't be. The woods behind the church can be scary, and shadows and dead animals can look like all sorts of things. But Mum, listen to me." She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Kowalski is a good Christian man. He's been taking care of our church since before you were born. Pastor Williams trusts him completely. Sometimes, when we let our imaginations run wild, we can convince ourselves we've seen things that aren't really there." David looked into his mother's kind, worried face, and saw something that crushed his spirit more thoroughly than his father's dismissal, or his sister's mockery. He saw pity. She thought he was sick, or disturbed, or simply too young and foolish to distinguish between reality and fantasy. The next morning, Margaret made a phone call that David wasn't supposed to overhear. Standing in the hallway outside the kitchen, still in his pajamas, he listened to his mother's hushed conversation with Pastor Williams. "I'm worried about him, Pastor," she was saying. "He's always been such a sensitive child, but this story he's telling is so disturbing. About seeing someone bury a body behind the church. He's convinced it really happened." Pastor Williams' response was too quiet for David to make out, but his mother's reply came through clearly. "Yes, I think that might help. He needs to understand that sometimes the devil works through our imagination, trying to make us see evil where there is only good. If you could speak to him, help him understand that what he thinks he saw was just his mind playing tricks." David crept back to his room and crawled under his covers, pulling them over his head until he was surrounded by warm darkness. But even there, he could still see that pale round object rolling through the autumn leaves. He could still hear the sound of something alive and terrified moving inside that black bag. No matter what anyone said, no matter how much they wanted him to believe otherwise, David knew what he had seen was real. And that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and impossible to dislodge. The meeting with Pastor Williams took place the following Wednesday evening in the church office. A cramped space that smelled of old coffee and mimeograph ink. David sat in a chair that was too big for him, his feet dangling several inches from the floor, while the pastor leaned back in his creaking desk chair and studied the boy with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Pastor Williams was a thin, angular man in his 50s with graying hair combed severely to one side and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light from the desk lamp in ways that made his eyes unreadable. He had been the spiritual leader of St. Mark's Lutheran Church for over 2 decades, and his voice carried the weight of unquestioned authority when he spoke about matters of faith and morality. "Your mother tells me you've been having some troubling thoughts, David," the pastor began, his voice gentle but firm. "She says you believe you witnessed something disturbing behind our church. I want you to know that you can speak freely here. This is a safe place." David shifted uncomfortably in the oversized chair, his Sunday clothes feeling tight and scratchy against his skin. The rational part of his mind knew this was his chance to convince an adult, to make someone understand that what he had seen was real and terrible. But sitting in that office, surrounded by religious texts and crosses and portraits of stern-faced church elders, His story suddenly seemed impossible even to himself. I saw Mr. Kowalski, David began hesitantly. He was carrying something heavy, a bag, and something fell out of it that looked like ... Like what, son? Like a skull. The words came out in a whisper, and David immediately wished he could take them back. They sounded absurd in this holy space, like the ravings of a disturbed child. Pastor Williams nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. David, I want you to think very carefully about what you're telling me. You're accusing a member of our congregation, a man who has served this church faithfully for 15 years, of something truly horrible. Do you understand the gravity of such an accusation? But I saw it, David insisted, his voice growing smaller with each word. I know how it sounds, but I really saw it. I believe you think you saw something, Pastor Williams replied carefully. But sometimes, son, the devil works through our imagination. He plants seeds of doubt and suspicion in young minds, trying to turn us against our fellow Christians. The enemy knows that children are particularly susceptible to such deceptions because their minds are still developing, still learning to distinguish between reality and fantasy. David felt something cold and heavy settle in his stomach. Even the pastor, a man whose entire life was supposedly devoted to truth and justice, was dismissing him. Worse, he was suggesting that David's vision was somehow evil, a manifestation of Satan's influence, rather than a cry for help. I want you to pray with me, David, Pastor Williams continued, rising from his chair and moving around the desk to place a hand on the boy's shoulder. I want you to ask God to cleanse your mind of these disturbing images and to help you see Mr. Kowalski, as he truly is a good man who works tirelessly to keep our church beautiful and welcoming. They prayed together in the dim office, the pastor's voice rising and falling in practiced cadences while David squeezed his eyes shut and tried to will away the memory of that pale object rolling through the leaves. But when he opened his eyes, the images were still there, as vivid and terrible as ever. The effects of that meeting followed David to school the next day, and the day after that. His teacher, Mrs. Coleman, had apparently received a phone call from his mother, because she began watching him with the particular intensity reserved for problem children. When David turned in a creative writing assignment about a boy who discovers buried treasure in the woods behind his house, Mrs. Coleman kept him after class. David, your mother mentioned that you've been having some vivid nightmares lately, she said, her voice artificially bright with the kind of cheer adults used when they were trying to fix broken children. I think it might be helpful if you talk to someone about these feelings you've been having. The someone turned out to be Mr. Peterson, the school's guidance counselor. A soft-spoken man with kind eyes and a beard that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. David found himself in Mr. Peterson's office twice a week, supposedly for academic counseling, but really to discuss what the adults in his life had collectively decided were troubling behavioral issues. Tell me about your drawings, David, Mr. Peterson would say, spreading out the pictures that David had created during art class. They were crude but unmistakably disturbing dark figures carrying mysterious bundles, holes dug in forest floors, objects that looked suspiciously like human remains scattered among autumn leaves. I just draw what I see in my head, David would reply, but even to his own ears, the explanation sounded inadequate. And where do these images in your head come from? Are they from movies you've watched, books you've read? David would shake his head, knowing that any attempt to explain would only make him sound more disturbed, more in need of the kind of help that involved doctors and hospitals and whispered conversations between worried adults. The worst part was how his classmates began to treat him. Word had somehow gotten out, probably through Sarah, who had never been particularly good at keeping secrets. David Hartwell had told some crazy story about seeing dead bodies behind the church. The other children, with the casual cruelty that only 11-year-olds could master, began to whisper whenever he walked by. There goes Graveyard David, they would say. Not quite quiet enough for him to miss it. Hey David, see any ghosts today? My mum says, your family's crazy. She says you make up stories for attention because your dad doesn't love you. That last comment, delivered by Jenny Morrison with the surgical precision of a playground sociopath, hit David like a physical blow. He spent the rest of that lunch period hiding in the library, hot tears streaming down his face as he pretended to read a book about dinosaurs. The isolation grew worse with each passing day. His former friends, the few he'd had, begun to avoid him with the instinctive wariness of children who sensed that association with David Hartwell might contaminate them with his strangeness. Teachers spoke to him in the careful, measured tones reserved for fragile things that might break at any moment. Even his own family seemed to walk on eggshells around him, as if afraid that the wrong word might trigger another outburst of disturbing fantasies. But the most insidious effect of all this adult concern and childhood cruelty was the way it made David begin to question his own memory. Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling while the old farmhouse creaked and settled around him, he would replay that October afternoon over and over in his mind. Had he really seen what he thought he'd seen? Or had his imagination, as everyone seemed to believe, transformed something innocent into something monstrous? Maybe it had been just a dead animal, as his father suggested. Maybe the pale object that had rolled from the bag had been a rock, or a piece of wood, distorted by shadows and his own overactive imagination. Maybe the sounds he'd heard from inside the bag had been the settling of trash, or the rustle of leaves, rather than the whimpers of something still alive. The doubt was almost worse than the original trauma. At least when he'd been certain of what he'd witnessed, he'd had the solid ground of truth beneath his feet. Now he felt as if he were drowning in uncertainty, grasping for something real to hold on to, but finding nothing but the shifting sand of other people's disbelief. One moonless night in November, desperation drove David back to the woods behind the church. His parents thought he was asleep, but he had crept from his bedroom window and walked the 2 miles to St. Mark's through the bitter cold, guided only by the pale light of distant stars. His hands were raw and bleeding by the time he finished digging in the frozen ground where he remembered seeing Mr. Kowalski work, but there was nothing there except rocks and roots, and the musty smell of decomposing leaves. Standing in that shallow hole he had scraped with his bare hands, David felt the last of his certainty crumble away. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe he was just a disturbed little boy with an overactive imagination and a desperate need for attention. The thought should have brought relief, but instead it felt like a kind of the death of his ability to trust his own perceptions, his own memory, his own truth. He filled the hole back in and walked home through the pre-dawn darkness, his feet numb in his thin sneakers, his soul heavy with the weight of surrender. The next morning, when his mother asked why his hands were bandaged, he told her he had fallen off his bike. She accepted this explanation with the grateful relief of someone who no longer had to worry about her child's disturbing fantasies. David never spoke of what he had seen again. He kept the memory locked away in the deepest part of his mind, along with a pencil drawing he had made that October, a crude but unmistakably accurate representation of a man in dark clothes carrying a bulging bag through the woods. He folded the drawing carefully and hid it in an old shoebox under his bed, along with diary entries he had written in his careful 11-year-old handwriting. "If anyone ever finds this, they will know I told the truth. I saw what I saw." October 11th, 1987. Now, standing in the present-day ruins of St. Mark's Lutheran Church, David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out that same folded drawing, yellowed with age and soft from decades of careful handling. He had found it 3 days ago while cleaning out his mother's house, buried in a box of his childhood belongings that she had saved for reasons he would never be able to ask her about. The demolition crew was scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning. The Millfield City Council had finally approved the urban renewal project that would transform this abandoned lot into a community center. After 35 years, the last physical remnant of his childhood trauma would be erased, replaced by something clean and modern and innocent of the terrible secrets that might lie buried beneath its foundation. David had driven here with no real plan, no clear sense of what he hoped to accomplish. Part of him wanted closure, some definitive proof that would either vindicate his childhood memory or finally put it to rest. But mostly, he simply needed to be here when the bulldozers came, to witness the end of a story that had shaped his entire life. The demolition began at dawn, heavy machinery roaring to life in the crisp morning air. David watched from his rental car as the wrecking ball swung in slow, devastating arcs, reducing the church building to rubble and splinters. By noon, nothing remained of the structure except a pile of broken wood and twisted metal. But it was the excavation for the new foundation that changed everything. As the bulldozer scraped away decades of accumulated soil and debris from behind where the church had stood, David saw the operator suddenly stop and climb down from his machine. The man walked to the edge of the excavated area, stared down at something, and then hurried toward the construction trailer, his face pale with shock. Within an hour, the construction site was swarming with police cars and county vehicles. Yellow tape cordoned off the area where the bulldozer had been working. Men in suits walked carefully around the perimeter, speaking in low voices and taking photographs. A coroner's van arrived, followed by what looked like forensic specialists carrying boxes of equipment. David sat in his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. After 35 years of doubt and self-recrimination, after decades of wondering if he was crazy or disturbed or simply a liar, the earth itself had finally spoken the truth he had carried all these years. The bones were old, the investigating officers told the small crowd of curious locals who had gathered at the police tape. Preliminary examinations suggested they had been in the ground for several decades. There appeared to be remains from multiple individuals, all showing signs of violent trauma. The investigation would be extensive, they said, involving state and possibly federal authorities. By evening, David's childhood memory was front-page news in the regional paper. Mass grave discovered at former church site. His sister Sarah called him at his hotel that night, her voice shaking with a mixture of awe and guilt. David, Jesus Christ, I'm so sorry. We should have believed you. We should have listened. But the vindication that David had imagined would feel triumphant was instead hollow and bitter. The investigation revealed that the church's former groundskeeper, Thomas Kowalski, had disappeared in early 1988, just months after David's sighting. His abandoned car had been found at the edge of the county, and authorities at the time had assumed he had simply left town to escape gambling debts. Now they understood he had fled to escape far more serious consequences. DNA analysis eventually identified 6 victims, all transients and runaways whose disappearances had been poorly investigated or ignored entirely. The oldest remains dated back to 1983. The most recent had been buried in late 1987. Almost certainly the person David had seen that terrible October afternoon. 9. The memorial. 1 year later, David returned to Millfield for the dedication of the memorial that had been erected on the site. The community center had been built as planned, but now it included a small garden and a plaque honoring the victims whose deaths had gone unnoticed for so long. The inscription read simply, "In memory of those whose voices were silenced, and in recognition that truth sometimes comes from the most unexpected witnesses." David stood before the memorial as the small crowd of survivors and community members dispersed. In his hand, he held the folded drawing from his childhood, the crude pencil sketch that had been his only proof for 3.5 decades. Carefully, he opened the time capsule that had been installed as part of the memorial, placed the drawing inside alongside letters from family members and statements from investigators, and sealed it closed. The sun was setting as he walked back to his car, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of that long ago October afternoon when his innocence had died in the woods behind a small-town church. But for the first time in 35 years, David Hartwell felt something approaching peace. The dead had finally been given their voices back, and the child who had tried so desperately to speak for them had finally been heard. 35 years later, he whispered to the gathering dusk, his words carrying on the evening wind toward the memorial where strangers now tended flowers in memory of the forgotten dead. They finally listened to me.